There is always someone around you in need of encouragement, your smile and your words of hope. You know him as Lieutenant Dan in the movie Forrest Gump, Gary Sinise. His stage, film, and television career has spanned more than 4 decades, earning him numerous awards and nominations like the Emmys, Golden Globes, Oscars, and many more. And you can find his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. In the midst of his career, Gary has stood as an advocate on behalf of America's service members, earning awards to name a few: the Bob Hope Award, the Congressional Medal of Honor Society's Patriot Award, and the Presidential Citizens Medal. But it hasn't always been easy for him, facing trials and heartbreak. Today, he shares his passion through the Gary Sinise Foundation, changing the lives of our veterans. This is his story. This is today's Nashville. This is Faith, Part 2. Gary, in your book, you received an award, which was
the National Commander's Award.
The National Commander's Award. And I read that there was one word that just stopped you when you were receiving it. Can you tell me about it?
Well, in the award, it says something about, wanting to thank me for
bringing the veterans.
Bringing veterans back into the consciousness of the American public. And I thought, why do we have to bring them back? They should just be there, These are our defenders. They are, people that sacrifice in service to our country. They get hurt, they get killed, they give their lives, they give their limbs. We should not be bringing them back into our consciousness. They should just be a part of our daily love and care and support. And so that struck me a little bit in the award. The award's over on the wall over there. And I thought, well, maybe there's something I can do about that and to help with that. I played Lieutenant Dan. He's a double amputee, a Vietnam veteran, blown up in the jungles of Vietnam. Through the DAV, and this is the Disabled American Veterans that gave me this award. At that time, they had 1.5 million members, and that's 1.5 million wounded veterans as members of their organization. So that was an impactful moment when I walked out on that stage, and I describe it in the book in the very first pages of walking out onto the stage and looking out in the audience and seeing 2,000 wounded veterans out there applauding me for playing this part in Forrest Gump. They had shown some video from the movie on the screens before I came out, and I remember standing backstage and I could hear my voice on the screen, screaming at the hurricane, screaming at God, whatever they were showing there. And then they introduced me and I walked out on stage, and everybody who could stand up was standing, and then there were others who were in wheelchairs, and they're applauding me for playing Lieutenant Dan. And it was very, very moving, very impactful. They presented me with the award. This is 30 years ago now. And from that moment on, I stayed in touch with them, and I wanted to help them. So I supported them in small ways. But then, shortly after, 7 years later, we had the attacks on our country on September 11th. And that really changed me in a big way. There's a chapter in my book called Turning Point, and it's the September 11th chapter. It's the chapter where I talk about how I felt that day and for the days after and months after, and how it affected me and how heartbroken I was and wanting to do something. And so I thought, having been involved with Vietnam veterans going back into the 80s, I got very involved with Vietnam veterans in the 80s when I was working at Steppenwolf, actually. as an artistic director, I wanted to find a piece of theater that would speak to the Vietnam veteran experience. And I found one that was written by a group of Vietnam veterans called Tracers. And it was originally it was written by a group of Vietnam veterans, and they were performing it. And I went to see it in Los Angeles, fell in love with it, was very, very moved by it, and wanted to direct it at Steppenwolf in Chicago, which I did. And that led me to start getting involved with local Vietnam veterans groups in Chicago. And this is back in the 80s, 10 years before Forrest Gump. So when Forrest Gump came along, and I'm playing a Vietnam veteran, and I'm invited to the national convention of the DAV, and they present me with an award, I just knew, you know, something was happening at that point. I was being prepared for what would happen when we were attacked on September 11th. And that was a true turning point for me to service and service work. And there was no going back after that. I mean, it was profoundly impactful, and I just knew that I was going to be very heavily involved with supporting the men and women who were deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan, their families, those who were getting hurt, you know, the real-life Lieutenant Dans I started supporting, and all that grew into the Gary Sinise Foundation.
You talk about that in your book, about going over and visiting the veterans or our service members in Iraq, and what was that like?
Yeah, the first trip I did was in June of 2003, so 21 years ago. And I volunteered to go to Iraq on the first big USO tour where they were taking entertainers and everything to Iraq. And I went as an actor, and you know, there was all kinds of people entertaining. Leanne Womack and Kid Rock, all these different people were entertaining, and I was Lieutenant Dan, shaking hands and taking pictures and signing autographs and, you know, talking with the troops and that kind of thing. And that was a gigantic moment. As soon as I got back from that trip, and I met thousands of troops, I called the USO and I said, where can I go next? And so within 3 weeks of getting back from Iraq, I was in Italy doing a tour, military bases all over Italy. And then I got back from that, and the next month I said, where can I go now? And then I went to Germany, did a tour in Germany. Then I went to Fort Stewart and Walter Reed and Bethesda Naval Hospital. And then I went, you know, back to Iraq, you know. So for 6 months I wasn't working at the time. So for 6 months I was just doing all this work with the USO and traveling with the USO. And that really solidified and galvanized this mission for me, because I could see what showing up on a military base or a military hospital was doing for somebody. It was lifting them up. It was helping to raise them up.